This video is about weak spots, and I'm going to go through, as a general rule, how do you identify weak spots on an enemy vehicle. In general, the weakest part of a vehicle is in the rear. This lower part here, the lower part below the axle, this back over here, the back of the turret are going to be weak. In this case, you can see it's 200 in the rear versus 280 in the front, or 150 for the hull versus 270 in the front. And then you have the side. Of course, the closer you are towards the ground is usually weaker, and the higher up you go has a little bit more strength, but it's still weaker than the front. Not true for every vehicle or every ammo. This is spaced armor, which means it can defeat uh, explosive rounds. But in general, that's the rule. The side is the second weakest portion of the tank. And then you have the front, which is the strongest part of the tank, and you have the roof, which is one of the weaker armors on the tank, and you have the bottom, which is underneath the tank. If you can splash a high explosive round on the ground and it explodes upwards underneath the tank, you can do damage to the tank. So when you look at the vehicle, in general, the smallest plates are the weak spots. So over here, you see that there's something called a driver hatch. It's got this joint over here, the hinge, and it's got a little slit and it flips upwards. That's probably a weak spot. And then you have a little gun that shoots out. That's probably a weak spot because it actually has to go through the armor. There's actually a hole in the armor and someone's sitting on the other side. Anything that's outside the armor, such as the gun, the headlight, these hinges, or whatever they are, the tow hooks, those are not weak spots. The portion above the track, the fender guard, is not a weak spot. So another rule is anywhere that there's the gun mantlet is usually the strongest part. So if you look at the part directly around the gun, that's usually the strongest part of the armor, which means you're unlikely to penetrate it unless you use a really, really high penetration round. So other weak spots are usually the smallest plates on the vehicle. You see over here, we've got on this left corner, on this right corner, the armor plates are very small, which means they're less likely to get hit, which means they're probably weak spots. It's weaker on the upper surfaces, such as the slope on the front. If you hit it with a high explosive round, you're more likely to penetrate as opposed to if you hit it dead flat over here or with a heat round. Usually higher up on the tank is stronger armor, and the weaker armor is usually lower on the tank, and it's usually weaker on the right or on the left and stronger in the middle. Not always true, but in many cases true. There's also weak spots. If you can hit right through this axle, bypass this armor, technically you're hitting the side. In some cases, that will also be a weak spot. Usually the cupola, which is sticking out, this big thing up on the top here, if you can hit that, that's usually also a weak spot. Along with the door on the back is usually one of the weakest parts of the tank. These items, the mufflers, are not weak spots. You can actually go to websites that will show you all the weak spots on the vehicle. The other thing you want to do is you want to hit it at the right angle. So if you're hitting the side, you don't want to aim for the back. You want to aim more towards the front because you get a better angle, which means it's less likely to penetrate. Ideally, you want to penetrate at a 90-degree angle, hitting it dead on, and then it really doesn't matter. But if you have the choice between the front, the middle, and the back, go for the back, because there are some tanks where the back is weaker than the front on the side. Now, again, there are some exceptions, and those exceptions are things like the Chaffee, which I believe has stronger side armor than the front. And then there's some British tanks like the Churchill, and there's some French tanks where the turret is weaker than the hull. You want to avoid hitting spaced armor on the side, especially with high explosive or heat rounds. I'm not saying it's impossible. I have done damage hitting spaced armor, but it doesn't always work. And the same is true for vehicles I'm going to show you, such as the Tier 8 American Medium, this vehicle right here, you notice that there's a plate of armor that goes on the side, the front, and the side. That is spaced armor. You don't want to hit that. You want to avoid hitting that. If you're firing an HE round, you want to aim for these little holes. I'll show you a gun sight. You want to aim for those little holes because you're likely to penetrate through that hole. And you'll notice over here there is spaced armor on top of the regular armor. So that gives an extra layer of defense, which is why this is a better armored vehicle. And the springs on top, they're external elements to the vehicle. They are not weak spots. They don't penetrate the armor of the vehicle. Okay, so we are going to look at a tank destroyer. Let's see if this one has a gun sight. You'll notice in the front there's a hole. You see that hole right there? It's a square hole right over here. And if you come over here, you'll notice that there's some sort of a contraption which has an arc to it. And it right over here, there's an eyepiece, and that is the little gun sight. If you aim and hit right through that little hole with an HE round, for example, then it will probably kill the gunner, which means it is technically a weak spot. I'm going to look at some other vehicles. What else we got here? The Maushan. On this, you've got the gun would be a weak spot. This little, the hole for the gun sight would be a weak spot. This over here, which is a viewport, is a weak spot. This over here, this round circle, is a weak spot. This might be a tail light. It kind of looks like a viewport, but there's no way that there's a person sitting behind there, so it's probably not a weak spot. This is a door to get into the vehicle. That means it's a weak spot. And then we're going to look at the Chrysler K, because this is an important vehicle to talk about in terms of weak spots. My understanding is that these guns are not weak spots, and that the frontal hull does not have any weak spots, which is shown in the armor modeling. Also be aware that some vehicles have what's called a V-shaped hull, which means that if you hit the side, you won't penetrate because it will bounce. There is a Russian tank that is like that. Unfortunately, I never played it because it came out after I played that. But some of the American tanks, you see over here, it looks like that hull is a little bit rounded. And you see over here on the bottom, it's got a shape to it. And you see over here, there's a shape over here. That gives it a little bit extra protection if you're hitting it from the side. Because if you hit too low, then it's going to hit at an angle and bounce off. So in order to hit the weak spot, you have to hit it a little bit higher. And be aware that some of these cupolas are super strong. They used to have, some of these American vehicles had super strong cupolas, but they're always changing the armor values of these vehicles. So over time, I don't play the vehicles often enough to remember what the weak spots are. Okay, so I hope that answers the majority of your questions about weak spots. If you have any questions or comments, please post below. Don't forget to follow me on Twitch.